Now, I'm Cathy McLean. I'm the chair of the independent chair of the ICS, just in case anybody hasn't met me yet. But I think most people, we've been on these meetings for a little while now. So welcome everybody. As I was saying, this is our meeting in public, and you've all got papers and so on. If I can kick off then with, there's the usual go on mute unless you're speaking and we'll bring you in and so on and so forth. You can use the hand raise thing, or you can just wave frantically at the screen, I suppose. And if none of that works, just shout, I think, is the bottom line. But somewhat, one way or another, I usually get to you. We've got some apologies today. We've got apologies from Mel Barrett, but I think Lucy Hubber is joining instead. Is that correct? We got Lucy?
That's correct. I don't know if she's here yet, Cathy. Okay. Hi.
Thank you. Tracy Taylor is not with us today, and I think you were mentioning Tim Geiler there, but I'm not sure if...
yes,
Tim is
I'm
here.
here,
He's
Cathy.
got
Hi.
Tracy written on him, but he's Tim as far as I can see. So welcome, Tim.
Thank you.
And Hugh Porter is not able to attend. We are reaching the holiday season, aren't we? So there's always a little bit of gaps at this time of the year, but Mike Crow should be here. Have we got Mike anywhere?
Yep, I'm here.
Fantastic. Well, welcome.
Hi.
Indeed. Paul Devlin is unable to attend either, but with no direct deputy, but John Bruin, I think, is with us and will represent the trust.
Hi, afternoon, I'm here.
Brilliant, thank you. Before we go on, I'd like to just mention that it's Nicole's last meeting in her role as the ICS clinical lead. Have we got Nicole here before I say nice things about her and then find she didn't even hear to listen? She is here.
I'm here, Cathy. But you can say whatever, it doesn't matter whether it's nice or not.
So last time in your current role as the ICS clinical lead, but I think you will stay with us as the board in a different role, more within your ICP leadership. Yes, great. So can I just formally thank you for everything you've done in your lead role? I think you've brought on the clinical and professional leadership hugely, and you leave a wonderful legacy on which the future will build. But we won't lose your input, obviously, as I say, and we look forward to continuing to work with you. But thank you very much. And I think on behalf of everybody, I'm sure I'm speaking when I say that. So great work, Nicole. And if you do take on different things, good luck with those as well. Though I think you're quite busy from all the conversations we've had. So moving along, the next item is conflicts of interest. I've got no particular ones raised thus far other than people's usual declarations. Is there anybody who wants to raise anything relating to the agenda? Nope. So the next one is the minutes of the 6th of May board meeting. They seem fine to me, but then there's always somebody who will find something specific. Can we take those as accepted, or have you got any points of particular? I think, Adele, I'm aware you were going to bring something up.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, just to clarify that I said that I wasn't able to sign up until it's gone through our governance process, and I guess the same applies to all of us from the city. It is planned to go through our governance process, and I do have some suggested amendments which I can either put today or circulate in advance, but I'll share my ideas for those, our ideas for those additions at the right point. But yeah, just wanted to clarify that what I'm very happy to take it, lead those discussions through our organisation, but we haven't signed up to it yet, though there is nothing in there in particular I object to, of course. It's, you know, I'd just like to add to it, really. Thank you.
Yes, that's absolutely fine, Adele, and let's just make that accurate in the notes. And I know you've shared some thoughts with me already about the additions. All looks good. So perhaps if you could share those with Rebecca, that would be great, and we can progress and accept absolutely your willingness to take that through process. And it will, in fairness, when we come on to that, I will say a little bit more about where I think it is and where we're going with it. So thank you. Any other amends to the minutes? I don't think so. So great. In due course, if I can sign those off, Joanna, that would be good. And then the action log. I was pleased to see we've got all the actions seem to be completed. Is there anything on there, Rebecca or Joanna, that you would want to highlight? No, that's excellent. So I think that's the key things. You can see there the work plan. I'm not proposing to discuss that now, but you can see that that's coming along and will evolve as time goes by. I think that takes us on nicely then to the first key item. And one of the things I wanted to say about this agenda is we've worked quite hard really to try and make sure that the agenda is in the space of the business that we're here to do, which is work on behalf of our population. There's lots of other things going on, and we'll touch on some of those during the afternoon, but I hope, and it'd be helpful to get your feedback on, are we managing to keep some focus on the wider purpose as to why we're here? We could easily get distracted down all sorts of structural things, but there's various mechanisms to make that happen anyway. So the first thing is our citizen story, which I'm pleased to say today sort of links to discussions we had last time around musculoskeletal. And I think I'm turning to Tilan to share with us some thoughts and a video, and also Jane Ferreira, who's going to present and answer some questions. If I can hand over to you, Tilan.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much, Board, for giving us the opportunity to present work on the musculoskeletal services in Mid-North and share a patient story. As it's a public meeting, just as a way of introduction, I'm a GP. I'm based in Abbey Medical Group, which is Ravenshead and Blidworth. I'm also the clinical lead for the Mid-North Integrated Care Partnership. Jane will introduce herself later on, and then we'll move on to a patient story. So a bit of a background about the challenge with musculoskeletal services. And if I split this into two, for our citizens, what we know is musculoskeletal conditions are the largest cause of years lost in disability. It is the third major cause of shorter health expectancy and burden from disease. And the 2020 National General Practice Survey showed nearly 21.3% of patients in Nottinghamshire had a musculoskeletal condition. Comparatively, nationally, this was around 18.5%. For the NHS, and the GPs in the room will know, nearly 1 in 5 consultations in primary care are due to MSK conditions. And if you look at a financial impact, musculoskeletal services can account to anywhere between 6 to 10% of our commissioning budget. So it has a significant impact for both the citizens and the NHS. Back in 2018, the MSK Together started to create an integrated service with the NHS partners working collaboratively. So this is about how we utilize our resources to get the best outcomes for the population as a whole, as well as for the individuals. So I'm hoping the MSK Together is an example of collaborative working, which would be a template for the new world we are emerging into, and to highlight the progress in moving to a value-based population health and care system using the MSK services in Mid-North as an exemplar. So that's a bit of a background. So I'll hand you over to Jane. Jane?
Thanks, Tilan. Hi, everyone. My name's Jane Ferreira. I'm head of MSK Together, which is the integrated MSK service in Mid-North ICP. So as Tilan said, MSK Together has been in place for a couple of years as an integrated service. And we're on a journey now to value-based healthcare and improving the value of the services that we deliver for the population that we serve. So essentially, we wanted to really make sure we can understand the needs of the population that we serve in Mid-North within the ICP. And we want to help people with MSK conditions live as good a life as possible, agreeing with what Tilan said about the burden of MSK conditions and the impact on healthy life expectancy. We also have agreed some outcomes and aim and a set of principles by which we want to deliver our service. We want to transform MSK Together into a network and not a series of stepping stones along a pathway and people having to navigate themselves through that. We want to measure our outcomes and say if we are improving the outcomes for the people that we serve. We think we like to do things that make things better, but we don't know. We don't measure it across the system. We measure very well in institutions and pockets of information, but do we look at it as a whole? We also want to move away from competing for our resources. We want to be able to work together to collectively own the resources that we are using so that we all decide together what is the best use to get the best outcome for the patients, rather than having that feeling of competition. We want to change it into collaboration. And we also want to make sure that the people who experience our service experience an integrated service. And we know that we've made some steps towards integration, but certainly, you know, our video will show you that there's still a challenge to go. And I'm hoping someone's going to play the video.
Joanne, I think you got the controls.
Oh, lovely. Thank you, Jeanette.
Is it me or can anyone hear?
I can't hear it.
No, there's no sound, I'm afraid.
It's muted, isn't it?
Jeanette's on mute, whether that makes a difference.
Jeanette, if you just unshare the video and click on optimize the video, it should play the sound. Sorry.
There's always a bit of a challenge with these things. You never know if they're quite going to work in spite of trying in advance.
My name's Deb Stewlake. I am a housewife at the moment because I have been registered disabled for the last 9 years. I literally was born into this with my right leg facing backwards. So it was dislocated and relocated at birth. And I always knew that I would have MSK conditions as I got older. Yeah, it's from my point of view, it's been really, really frustrating because I was young. So locally, I was told that I was too young to have anything, a hip operation in that respect. So over the years, then obviously how I walked has changed. That's had effects on my my feet, my back, my weight. And it's all sort of knocked on there with pain medication, trips to my GP. It's triggered another syndrome called fibromyalgia, where the body can't deal with the pain and things like that. So I've become very oversensitised. But locally, it's been frustrating and frustrating because my expectations maybe were too high initially. It was never explained to me the reasons behind why I was being delayed treatment. I think when you're in pain and you can see no light at the end of the tunnel, I think that is a really, really dark place to be as a patient. And that's why ultimately I became involved in this MSK Together scheme. So it seems to be that the GP was the gatekeeper to everything. You know, you literally had to go and see my GP, have a chat to him. He would then send a referral letter. That referral letter then would take its time. I then went to see podiatry. I must say, from actual referral, the service is great. Lots of different locations for me to be able to go and see. So Mansfield Community, here at Ashfield Community Centre. So there was lots of different locations that were available, but it was that initial getting into the system and having to go to the GP. And we all know how busy GPs are at this moment, even at any time, even before COVID. And the longer that these things are taking to happen, the more pain and discomfort that patients are in, the more obese patients are because the less mobile they are. And that then's got to have its knock-on effect on other services, you know, within the system. You know, for us, I think this is it's been absolutely amazing that we've been able to get absolutely everybody in the room, albeit via the laptop, obviously with COVID restrictions, but we've been able to get everybody in the room, from physios to doctors to GPs to consultants to patients. You know, me and Gilly have been on the board, and another specialist that have been able to advise with regards to how this system could work. And it's got to work for everybody ultimately, and it, you know, for me to be able to be part of this as a one-point contact, that the patients ultimately get the right treatment at the right time for everybody that's involved. And then ultimately, if you change all the pathways where you're having to go back to the beginning to be able to get to the service that you're wanting to, you know, that's got to then save time, and that ultimately then will save pain and discomfort for the patients more than anything. The staff have always been amazing. You know, when I've been there, in some ways they're just as frustrated. They're wanting to be able to deal with their patients. That's why they took their jobs. You know, they wanted to make the differences in their patients' lives, make the changes, make them happier, make them more comfortable. You know, it's the frustration is just as much theirs as it is ours. I would love to have a survey going out and patients actually saying this service has meant that there was light at the end of the tunnel, because a lot of it as well is expectations. So it's about clinicians and consultants and HCPs actually telling their patients that this is the clear pathway, this is MSK Together, this is how it will work, and we've got clear aims and objectives, clear ways that we want it to work, clear ways of everything ticking over that will then lead to patient satisfaction. If I hadn't had this hip done last November, I don't even know where I'd be now. I really don't, and that is hand on my heart. You know, it's drove me to the edge of the abyss. That's what this means, and if I was still in that situation now, I don't know what I would have done, and that's what this difference would mean. Let's straighten the pathway, let's not make it as wibbly wobbly as it is now, and let's make things better for everybody.
So that's the end of the presentation. Sorry, patient story, apologies. There was a few slides which I will take it as read. So rather than go through the slides, I think, conscious of the time, maybe myself and Jane are more than happy to answer some questions, Kathy. So,
well, thank you very, very much, and you know, thank you to Debs, isn't it, for her doing that, and obviously being really, really involved in all of this, and just shows you how important it is to have the service users actually creating this. So I think we've time for one or two comments or questions from anybody. So anybody want to raise a hand, ask anything, or make any comments? Yes, Nicole.
Yeah, I mean, apart from to say, you know, this is kind of the blueprint of how we should be going about designing and implementing our services. So I'd say, you know, well done to Mid-Knots, and obviously very interested to have a conversation about what we could learn. And if I'm honest, pinch with pride in South Knots.
That's brilliant. You know, sharing across the system is absolutely what we're about. So thank you very much for that. I'll take a few comments and then perhaps you might want to come back on that, Tilan. John Bruin?
Yeah, thanks. Afternoon, everybody. John Bruin, Chief Executive of Knots Healthcare. Great presentation and really good evidence of a transformation of a pathway that's adding value. Just to say, I completely agree with Nicole in terms of this is a good model to use in terms of tackling the age-old challenge about managing access and speeding access up and reducing morbidity. We've got some, not necessarily quite as integrated as that, but some pathway transformations in the mental health sphere that equally are the sort of more direct access that's triaged directly. So, for example, improving access to psychological therapies and national programme, direct access there works really quickly, getting service users to inputs really quickly. And then the other thing that people may be aware of pertinent to system working is the mental health support teams into schools, sort of joint venture with Department for Education, Department of Health. We're working really closely with our mental health support teams and local authorities across the county. And we've got teams now direct into over 100 schools where it's a whole school approach that doesn't need the very traditional general practice referral. Obviously really important in part of the overall inputs, but again, really good evidence that these sorts of things work. Thanks.
Thanks, John. So a couple there on sharing, which you might want to come back to Jane and Tilan in a minute. And I'll take two more comments on this, one from Richard Mitchell and then Mike Crow, please.
Hi everyone, I'm Richard, I'm the Chief Exec at Sherwood and I work in Mid-Knots. Thank you Jane and Tilan for the presentation. Just 2 points for me. One is as I was looking at the agenda for today, at the top of the agenda it states the principles for joint working, so things such as putting citizens at the heart of our thinking, being ambitious for the health and well-being of our population, and working in principle by system by default. And it struck me that I think those three principles run throughout this work. The other bit was this came to our public integrated ICP meeting for Mid-Knots. I think it was in June. It didn't make it into the final slides, but we had a really interesting, the slides for today, but we had an interesting slide at the ICP meeting, and we were looking at sort of the way in which the service can take steps to reduce health inequalities. And through this piece of work, Jane and Tilan and others have identified that if you are being treated for hip or knees, and you're living in wards that are identified as being most deprived, your chance of having a hip and knee replacement are less than 50% of if you live in the least deprived electorate wards, which I thought was an interesting but shocking and quite saddening statistic. So this work is also focusing on population health and reducing health inequalities.
Fantastic, really good comments. That one about the two different, I'm glad you've got some evidence about that, because that's been my theory for some time, is the chances of having a hip or knee depend on where you live, but that's really interesting. Mike?
Yeah, it's just, I don't want to repeat everyone else's comments, but I think that comment about patients understanding the pathway that they were on, being able to sort of navigate and understand where they are on the journey and what the plan is really important, and communicating that all the way along. I think that's something we're really familiar with in general practice, where patients get referred, they don't quite know what the next step, what would happen then, and even where to go to when then they're not going through. So carrying patients through, understanding the path that they're on is really crucial to the way that you design a pathway. So it's not just about designing the pathway, it's designing a pathway so that that is shared all the way along. And I think that comment about being less likely to have an operation is really telling, and we always think it's something to do with patients navigating the system, and more articulate patients being able to overcome those barriers that are just, we don't intend to build in, but they're built in somehow. And we've just got to build a system so that it doesn't have these areas of friction.
Thank you very much. I'm going to let Tilan and Jane have the final, well, at least respond to those if you wish. Who's going first?
So Kathy, I'll go first, Jane, and I'll let you have the last word onto it. Thank you very much for that feedback, and really appreciate that. Just coming back to the learn and share, and that's exactly why we would want to do this. So from the 3 ICP perspectives, we have different projects we're doing, and we've been through this journey. We've got the scars, and so what we would want to do is hopefully by sharing it, the others don't need to go through the same pain which we've been through, and then actually say what works well, what didn't work well. And likewise, like John, you said about the stuff around the mental health, and it's about adapting and seeing. While we work as a system, this is where sometimes having that understanding at place-based level and understanding the needs of the population, understanding the prevalence, and where we can have the services which actually works around the patient. So the thing which Mike, you said, yes, we want to minimize the handoffs. We don't want to, like Deborah said at the patient story, not needing to go back to a GP for referral, because it's all about task duplicity, and we're just creating bureaucratic steps right the way throughout, and we're delaying the patient's journey. So putting the patient at the center and thinking about the patient's experience and looking at the sort of value-based healthcare, not purely on the activity and the numbers, can change the way how our services are provisioned within place and as a system. So really thank you very much for everyone's feedback on this, and we'll take that back on board. So Jane?
Jane, anything final from you?
I was just going to say, it's not as simple as designing pathways. If it was that simple, we should be all over it already. The pathways often don't fit. They fit the very few people that fit into neat boxes. And let's face it, there's not many of those in our population. So we have to provide something more. We have to be a network. We have to understand the needs of the patients on a personalized level and be able to care navigate with them, empower them to understand their conditions. And also when it comes to learning lessons, again, it's not something that you can just transfer across. There's a lot of work about the culture involved and the stewardship it's a culture of stewardship within MSK Together. And you do have to spend a lot of time building relationships, because we're having difficult and interesting conversations and different, coming together in different ways than we have previously. So there's definitely kind of a model that you can adopt with regards to how we do culture, stewardship cultures and who needs to get in the room, but you still have to spend that time together and work it out as a kind of group as much as anything.
Thank you very much.
We're definitely at the beginning.
But very good. So just a few summary comments from me is, first of all, thank you to everyone involved. It's really good to hear directly from a service user or patient's voice, a citizen, somebody who's actually going through this. We can all imagine, but it's not the same as hearing it. So I think that's really, really valuable. Secondly, I think there's some points being made about sharing. Yes, there's a lot of work to do, but there's clearly things to learn. And also, I think John Bruin's point about there are lots of other things as well. And I'd like to see, that we get examples of those coming through here over time. I think that would be really good. And then the final thing for me is good to think that we can start to link some of this to our outcomes. And I think the point Richard Mitchell made about, the links to the inequalities here and how this can help, I think is a really important one. So all around, really, really good. And I'm sure there'll be lots of follow-up and actions that ensue from this. But the main thing is to give us that feel for what it's like to be a service user and perhaps having an improved service because of the work that you've done in an integrated way. So thank you. Good. So I'll move us on then to the report, which is the first time we've done this, a written report from the chair and the lead executive. Again, it'd be helpful for us to receive feedback, but we plan, unless people say don't, to do that each time. I'm not going to go through the bits that are already written because you can read those, but just a couple of additional things to me, then I'll hand on to Amanda. you know, since this was written, of course, we've had a new Secretary of State for the Department of Health and Social Care. The whole thing has meant that there's a little bit of a pause going on at the moment. Partly, I suppose, if you were him, you'd want to get your head around the brief, wouldn't you? So for various reasons, that some things are just being paused a bit. We, in the meantime, are going to crack on with the things we can do, but obviously we'll be mindful of any changes in the timetable. I think overall, though, I would say when I look at all aspects of the work that everybody's doing, I think we're making quite good progress. Some things are a little further ahead than others, but on the average, I can see progress in everything that we're doing. And I think that's really useful to note. We have got some big challenges across the patch, and Amanda will make reference in due course to some of those. But lots of good work going on, and I thank you for your endeavours. But it's a tight timetable we have if it remains at April 22, and that is still the plan. So Amanda, can I just hand on to you for any more additions you want to make?
Yes, thank you, Kathy. Just a couple of points. I wanted to say I thought the June board development session was really useful in terms of giving us that steer on our local interpretation of how the ICS will work going forward. And also, since the last board meeting, the ICS design framework has also been published. So we've been busy sort of putting some more local shape around how we're going to all work together. And really pleased that there is good alignment between our sort of local conversations as well as the sort of policy design framework from NHS England and improvement. Some of our sort of local conversations were very much around the ICS partnership being pivotal and as a guiding mind in setting our broad strategy, and then the ICS board fitting within that as the sort of NHS component of that. I think that's really important in our overall integration journey. And we want that partnership to be really vibrant and influential and work together on that. So the ICS board and colleagues around the table will continue to steer that, and we will continue to have regular sort of conversations moving forward around how we work. We have a transition and risk committee which has been set up on behalf of the board, which is an assurance committee. It's not doing. We have a very distributed leadership arrangement around the development of the system, and we want to really promote and continue with that. And then finally, just so we are still working to the current timelines, but obviously, as Kathy has said, that that's a little bit unclear at the moment, and that relates to the boundary decision as well. Thank you. That was all I wanted to say.
Thanks, Amanda. I don't know if there's any quick reflections on any of that, any questions anybody wants to raise at this point. It's largely for information, but do let us know if it's helpful to have that summary. It will evolve, and we might put different kinds of things into it and so on, but it feels an important thing to make a statement of where we kind of, and key messages that might not come up elsewhere. Good. So our next item, we've already sort of made mention of, and Adele raised earlier, is really to discuss again the ICS board partnership agreement. We discussed it in May at our meeting there, and continued work has gone on to try and strengthen this. And I think, as Adele said, she'll pass in some suggestions about strengthening it even further. We've now got it in a format that's, if you like, a bit more exciting to look at. I mean, it's not the be all and end all to have it exciting to look at, but I hope people like the way that's laid out and so on. Do make any suggestions. I think where it'd be good to get to is some agreement that this is now workable, we can use it. And I was pleased to hear Richard referred to it directly in regard to the item on the citizen story, but that we will develop it further. So it won't stay still, it will develop, and we will get wider engagement in it. I know some organisations have already done some of that, but I think there's wider to be done on this. So that's all I was going to say at that point, but ask Amanda, is there anything that you wanted to add on that at the moment? Then let's throw that open for comments.
Nothing further to add from me, thank you.
Okay, so any additional thoughts on the agreement? Is it going in the right direction? Are we nearly there in terms of something that we can really, really work to, but in the meantime, use these principles in the way we work together? Any thoughts on any of that? Adele?
Yeah, thank you. So I had some suggested additions, which I realise is difficult to do live, as it were, but if I just give you a highlight of them, which is in our ways of working section, just to add in to the second bullet point, we'll prioritise resources to where they have the greatest impact on health inequalities. We'll prioritise making a positive local economic impact in our procurement and contracting. We'll work as a system to be environmentally responsible, working collectively to improve air quality and to make healthy and sustainable travel choices easier. So that just kind of gives you a flavour, and then there's just an additional thing, additional strengthening around health inequalities, that we all commit as signatories to consider health inequalities and the contribution we make to the wider determinants of health across our footprint in all aspects of our services. So it's, I think it's in keeping with discussions we've had. So, I hope, and we've, as I say, we've yet to take it formally through our council governance processes, but I just wanted to flag that there would be the sorts of areas that we would hope to kind of strengthen that commitment around health inequality to just make it a little more real in the document. Thank you.
Great, Adele. And as you can see from it, many organisations have already added physically the signatures as such, but those, personally, I think Adele's suggestions sound absolutely great, actually, because I think they link very much to the four key aims. I think it's a quadruple aim, really, we need to talk about, not a triple aim, isn't it? And Adele did link to that in some of the sustainability elements. So that would be my thoughts, but for goodness sake, I'm only the chair. So Richard, what are your thoughts?
I think seeing all those signatures is sort of really strong symbolism and evidence is the working together. Two points for me that I think I made last month or the month before. One is, for me, it's about us being able to strike a balance. So whilst we're signing up to the partnership agreement, we need to make sure that doesn't mean that we can't disagree. Disagreement is good, debate is good. It's about doing it in line with the values that we've described here. Secondly, I'm not concerned about the conversations we have in public board or in our short private board. For me, the real test of this is about the way that it sort of percolates through our organisations and the way that we can empower the teams beneath us to work together. And I think testing that out and ensuring that we're delivering on that is trickier than measuring the way that we conduct ourselves through this board.
Yes, and I think those are good points. And the point about we need to be able to disagree in line with the values, I think is a really important one. And we've touched on this previously. And I think certainly it's something that Amanda and I have certainly talked a fair amount about, is how do we make that real? Because actually, it's only when there's something you don't all agree on that you actually get to somewhere on, that you realise you've really got a partnership agreement, compact, whatever you want to call it. We call it an agreement. So I think you need to keep bringing us back to that, Richard. But more importantly, we need to use examples of where we can actually make that happen. And I think we have some in reality. I think we do have some. I agree with you. The signatures are powerful, but we need to constantly work in this, and getting it percolated down our organisations is really that next step. Otherwise the partnership will only ever be something that's really understood by a smallish number of people, and we won't have the impact for our population, which is would be really sad, because that's what we're here for. So I'm going to take it that everybody's broadly comfortable with the direction here. We will keep coming back to this. We will use it in reality, and I hope it helps us. And I'm pleased that we've got to this point.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks. So the next item, and I'm really pleased and excited about this. This is item 7, and it's insights on health and wellbeing in Nottingham and Nottinghamshire. I'm delighted that Jonathan and Lucy, I think, are going to share this with us. I think I've previously said at these meetings that the JSNA, in shorthand, the Joint Strategic Needs Assessments, which you've helpfully put in front of us there, is something that, and indeed, of course, we've got 2 councils, and 2 health and wellbeing boards, so we have 2. Is something for me that's not been paid enough attention over the last few years. And I'm really pleased to see that we're going to get a chance to discuss this and think about this in terms of our future context. So less from me and more from the people who matter. Jonathan and Lucy, I will hand over to you to assume that you know which order you're doing yourselves in. So thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. We're really pleased to come to board this afternoon. My name is Jonathan Gribbin. I'm the Director of Public Health in Nottinghamshire County, and I'm really pleased to be co-presenting with Lucy Hubber, who's Director of Public Health in Nottingham City. And it's really nice to be re-engaging with the ICS. We're just, certainly in the county, just starting, we're on a transition back to recovery. We're looking forward to engaging with some really important public health agendas and priorities. And Joint Strategic Needs Assessment is certainly one of those. I know that it's something which many of you have advocated strongly for over the years, and it absolutely ties in with that principle which Richard referred to a few minutes ago about putting the needs of citizens right at the heart of what we do in all of our joint working. So it's a real priority to us, and certainly in the context of the challenges of increasing healthy life expectancy, where we see it stalled in some of our communities, and in the context of some fairly stark health inequalities and constrained resources, and the reality of that for all of us, it's more important than ever that we understand really well the health status and needs of our populations and how it varies across our populations, that we know what is most effective about to address those needs and the really big issues, and that we're really clear about how commissioners and providers and others, what they can do about those needs. So although producing a joint strategic needs assessment, as you hinted at, Kathy, is a statutory duty for health and wellbeing boards, and giving regard to it is a statutory duty of some local NHS organisations, commissioners in particular, actually it's something that we need to be doing in any case. I'm hoping that someone can operate the slides for me and just move me along one slide, please. You've have had a paper already circulated to you. What Lucy and I will do is just to take you through 4 or 5 slides by way of structuring some discussion points that we'd like to bring to you. So Kathy has already mentioned that the footprint of the Nottingham and Nottinghamshire ICS covers 2 health and wellbeing boards, each of which have their own statutory duty for producing this thing called a joint strategic needs assessment, and in respect of their own local authority populations. But actually there are no templates or very little in terms of mandatory requirements about how we each go about doing that, and there's quite a lot of flexibility therefore. And that flexibility we've been pleased to exercise in city and in county over recent years to make sure that we take a broadly consistent approach to that. So you'll find a fair amount of overlap, and it's within our gift now as partners around the table really to define what is needed to make joint strategic needs assessment and that process really fit for purpose for the ICS going forward. We have, of course, had to pause quite a lot of work over the last 18 months, and I won't go into all of that now, but we are moving to the point where we can re-establish much of that. One of the things that we want to really underline and get your help with this afternoon in re-energising some of that work is to secure a fresh and really strong steer from partners around the table about the topics of joint interest and strategic importance, which really warrant a focus within the joint strategic needs assessment. And so that's one of the things that we're going to be asking you about in a few moments to help us identify those topics, and also put in place arrangements which will enable ICS partners to continue to give that steer in the period ahead. Next slide, please. And I think at this point, it's Lucy, it's over to you, I think.
So can I apologise? I actually can't see anything at all, Jonathan. I haven't got any pictures of anybody or anything. So can I ask you to take through the whole presentation, because I'm completely blind?
Of course.
I've been desperately pressing buttons, but with no success, I'm afraid.
No worries. Lucy, I'll pick up from here then, and but please contribute to the discussion as you see fit, and please round out anything that you feel that I may have partly missed. So the third slide that I just want to take you through really is pointing towards the future. We have in the paper that we've circulated provided you some information about what has been on our current work programs within the city and in the county, and that largely reflects topics which were suggested prior to the start of the pandemic. One of the things I'm going to be asking you about in a moment or two is to contribute your input around JSNA products. So those could be chapters, or they might be pages of information that pull together and provide signposts to other relevant information, and particular topics that those might focus on. Now, they may focus on, in quite a clinical sense, on different disease areas. They might focus on different parts of our population, different groups of citizens. In other ways, they might focus more closely on geographical areas. So wards, or what in NHS speak are referred to as primary care networks, PCNs, or districts, and so on. So in order to make sure that we align the joint strategic needs assessment really closely with the needs of the ICS, we want to invite you to support the development of it by providing a much stronger, regular strategic steer. And we would invite you to do that really by identifying emerging issues of joint interest and strategic importance. Next slide, please. So the recommendations in the paper pick up some of those themes. We are really looking for a very explicit acknowledgement that the responsibilities to produce the joint strategic needs assessment, to the extent that they fall explicitly on local authorities and currently on clinical commissioning groups, really represent joint responsibilities. And so in that, we're really looking for that strong steer, and that going forward, ICS partners together will contribute not only to that strategic steer, but also to the production of the joint strategic needs assessment. It's something which in public health, in our two teams, in the city and in the county, we're pleased to facilitate. And in many cases, we're pleased to develop the content as well. But it's really important, if this is going to live for the ICS, and we're going to exploit its value, that other partners are also taking an active role in contributing to it. And so we just need to think through some of the implications for us and the resource requirements around that. So you can see the recommendations there. Next slide, please. Now, at this point, colleagues, I'm going to ask you to bear with me while I skip around just a little. There are two slides I have now which pick up some discussion points. You'll see the main question in bold at the top, with 2 or 3 bullet points beneath them with some further questions which might prompt your engagement. Rather than start off by addressing the question on this slide, I'm going to jump forward one, if I may. and ask you rather to start off with this one. So I'm just going to ask you to come back with some comments, observations, suggestions about how you might wish us to particular issues, topics, areas of interest that you might wish us to focus the next round of JSNA development on. You might also wish to make suggestions around how we can present the intelligence and the data in a way which better supports the work of the ICS. Chair, if you'll help me with time, what I'm hoping also to do is then to flip back to one slide to the discussion point on the previous slide, which is more about how we go about doing it and the structures and arrangements we put in place. So, Chair, if you're happy with that, I'd be pleased just to engage board members on this first question here.
Thank you very much. And I think it's fair to say that there's a lot to understand about JSNA, and I was privileged to have a bit of a teach-in recently on the matter with Jonathan. But yes, we've got about 15 minutes actually, Jonathan, so we can use a bit of time now. So, any thoughts on this first question? Because there's one bit in my head that's saying when we have the ICS partnership, which is the wider grouping, that may well be the future state. At the moment, it's here, the ICS board as we are at the moment, I think, is what you're referring to, Jonathan. In the future, I suspect that a lot of this, again, going back to what Amanda said, the concept that we've got around the ICS partnership being the guiding mind, well, there's a requirement for its guiding mind to think about the input, which is the JSNA, input and output, really, from the way you've described it, Jonathan. But if we can just deal with the here and now, I guess, is probably the best thing. So how can we input to this? What are people's thoughts at this stage? Anybody want to jump in?
So Kathy, it's Melanie. I've had my hand up. Would you like me just to chip in? I can see John Doddy also has his hand up as well.
Yes, I've got it. Yeah, you go ahead.
Yes, so for me, this is core to our business going forward. It should have been, but clearly we've been in a pandemic, so we haven't been able to give the kind of attention and leadership to thinking forward that we would like. I think there's a couple of things for me in that question. So a recent example is we've tried to pull off a mental health impact assessment as a system, and we've had a couple of stumbling blocks. One is really on how to collaborate, particularly at a point when we're all feeling quite pressured in organisations. So that has been a barrier. The other bit really is how we can pull together our data analytics in a way that satisfies information governance. So I think in terms of how can the ICS board ensure the JSNA, I think those are two issues that we would need to really focus on. So how do we do collaborative commissioning, strategic planning, and then how do we ensure that we've enabled the work of the date board sufficiently to overcome some of those issues, because we've struggled just on something which you would think would be quite straightforward, and you would think would be quite topical given we know the impact of COVID on mental health and vice versa. So just some reflections there from me.
That's really good. Jonathan, I think probably what we'll do, we'll gather a few of these, and then perhaps if you could reflect back. It's always difficult to sort of have the conversation back and forward in these meetings, but if we just gather a few things, is that okay? And you could perhaps pull it together with some reflections. We won't solve all of this here, but it's great that there's two really good points there. So I think, Adele, is that a new hand from you?
No, it was actually an old hand. But I just to flag, had a really interesting conversation around this very area of how the about how public health will work alongside the date, but well, the intelligence function of the central ICS, and kind of how they work together to sort of operationalise the knowledge that we have, the understanding that we have from the JSNAs. So I think we've got some really exciting possibilities there.
Great, thank you. We'll add that to the mix. Amanda.
Thank you. So a pitch for topics and also a commitment as well. So I think for me that I think the JSNAs are most valuable when we're seeking to understand sort of new and emerging areas of need, because I think we've got some other mechanisms. I think we do need to refresh them on some of the more established areas, but we've probably got better mechanisms. So a couple of pictures would be something around a sort of post or a sort of impact of COVID on the population health, both in terms of long COVID, but also psychological impacts and how that might change the health kind of responses that we need to make. So just a bit of a picture around what's the impact of COVID on our population health. And albeit that might be something around inequalities as well and where they've got worse. We've struggled a little bit around fully understanding, and again, we've touched on this on and off, neurodevelopmental disorders and how that might impact on our population, and getting a really strong sort of shared sort of plan around that. So I didn't know if that might be an area. And then if there are very specific things, we said we wanted to focus on healthy life expectancy. Tilan mentioned MSK earlier, but I think if there are very significant things that we think are important in terms of healthy life expectancy that we might want to focus on. So that was my sort of pitch around potential areas. And then also a commitment. I think I was probably hold hand up that say that this sort of NHS commissioning part of the system, we've sort of seen it more as a public health endeavour that we sort of contribute to rather than a really joint piece of work. So a commitment to make sure that we have got capacity to do what you've requested, Jonathan and Lucy, but also to try and unblock some of the things around data sharing as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. I'll take one more and then let you come back, I think, and then before we do the others, Jonathan. So I think I've got Tilan next.
Thank you very much, Kathy. Jonathan, I'll probably go up to the main paper to the point. It'll be easier for me to. So it's 3 points, if I may. The first one is about on point number 10 and the 4 points which you raised onto that. I suppose in terms of trying to answer the question which is on the screen now, there is a similar amount of work which has been done through the ICP. So for example, in Mid-North ICP, we've had established 5 priorities with about 10 objectives. And to minimize sort of duplication, and that could help. I'm not saying they need to be adapted itself as a JSNA, but sharing that learning from what's been done in the places, both city and south, and that can partly steer the discussion in terms of identifying what giving you the strategic steer. That's my second point is with regards to the JSNA products, and it's number 11, the PCN datasets or PCN profiles. I remember pre-COVID, you did an excellent presentation in the Mid-North ICP showing the PCN profiles. And at that time, that set of data was far more powerful than the PCN profiles which were being developed by RightCare. Now, this raises another question, is that often we do come across excellent data sources or products which we fail to move that from what's been an excellent product. How can that actually steer, or it's used for the planning and delivery at a PCN base? It's excellent. It shows the health inequalities. It shows the variations within the PCN population group. But the next bit is, so what? How do we actually make that as an enabler for the planning and delivery, and equally taking the funding into account? And my third point is on the point number 18. It just says about an annual statement for the partners. Because we are discussing about the strategic importance and some strategic objectives, I wonder what the merits. I suppose this is more statutory, revisiting this annually, because I suspect most of this is more of an intermediate and long term. These projects or interventions are probably going to take 3 to 5 years, and we need to follow on through rather than revisiting the strategy on an annual basis. So that was more of a comment in terms of, and probably partly my ignorance of not being there involved in the JSNA previously. So thank you very much, Kathy.
Thank you. Jonathan, if I can turn to you, and then I'm going to take comments from, given the time, I think Alex is there, John Doddy, Tim Geiler, and Michael Williams, and then we'll try and see if you've got what you need there. But John, do you want to make any comments on the things you've heard?
Thank you, Kathy. It's been helpful already. So in terms of how we might collaborate together, I think there are probably some arrangements that we can usefully put in place between our respective health and wellbeing boards and representatives from the ICS and the ICPs, and I think also the other thing I would just note in terms of the work on JSNA, I think we'll also just need to revisit how that fits alongside the work of population health management and where that now sits and gets driven from within the ICS, because I think that might be important just to clarify that. Thank you, Amanda, for the suggestions around those new and emerging needs. And I think if we're looking at the impact of COVID and or neurodevelopmental disorders, I think both of those straight away you can see the extent to which those are of joint interest and actually would certainly need to be a joint endeavour. So thank you for your commitment as well to co-resourcing this with us. Tillan, in terms of ICPs, that's a really important point you make. And I think at certainly at the County Health and Wellbeing Board, as we get going again there, we'll be pleased to ensure that we've got really good, strong representation from Nottinghamshire County ICPs. And I think through the Health and Wellbeing Board, if nowhere else, you'll also have opportunity to steer the JSNA chapters that we're producing there. You made, I think, probably 2 or 3 points about the PCN profiles and the number of good resources there are out there. So one of the things I think we can do for the IC or help with for the ICS, both from a city and a county perspective, is drawing together into one place or perhaps one page where there are some complementary resources like PCN profiles. But you're right, I think it's there's then a job of work to do to make sure that we translate those into the sort of the so what are we going to do now on the back of that. In terms of the rhythm and frequency around this, I think it probably does need an annual at least an annual look at this, but I'm happy to come back to you if I may have misunderstood your point about frequency. Back to you, Kathy.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think all those points sound really helpful. Could I ask that the next speakers are reasonably brief, and we may be able to note the comments, and then I will come back to the recommendations in the paper and see what the board feel about that. But I think Alex, did I say? I think you were next, aren't you?
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. So similarly to others, really welcome this. I think this could be a really central part of our work going forward. For my kind of sort of engagement team within NHS land, I'm intending over the coming period to sort of transition that from quite a kind of traditional approach to a much sort of more citizen intelligence oriented approach, which means listening much more broadly, scanning much more broadly for issues or emerging kind of opportunities on a quite broad basis rather than necessarily diving into known topics. So I wonder if there's an opportunity for us to use the JSNA process, not dissimilar to what Amanda said actually, to kind of identify potential areas where there are barriers to access or hidden health inequalities. You know, if we weren't listening well enough, maybe there would be other areas like MSK that we heard this morning, where it is increasingly difficult for people to access the right care. How can we use the JSNA to try and spot those as efficiently and effectively as possible across the whole system so we can tackle them? So that would be my pitch for a potential topic, perhaps a sort of overarching chapter or introduction. And where I can with my team and the engagement resources across the system, yes, absolutely, we'll commit to help resource and support and deliver that work as well.
Thank you, Alex. Some good suggestions there around particularly this lens of health inequalities, as I call it. We need to be seeing everything through that lens, don't we, really? John Doddy.
Yes, thanks. I think the JSNAs have obviously been around for a long time, and they've always had a significant importance to the Health and Wellbeing Board be it the city through Adele, Williams, or through ourselves, many of which are commonly shared. And Adele mentioned air pollution. There's no point in the county working on its own air and then the city having to work on a different plan for its air. So there's an awful lot of things which by their very nature have got to be shared. And the ICS is obviously a fantastic vehicle through which to do a lot of that joined up work. I'd like to say that one of the big things that needs to be addressed is restoration of the damage of COVID to the population, be it through obesity, mental health, alcohol excess, drug abuse, etc. Restoration is a sort of a chapter that we've never had to deal with before because it never existed. I think in the aim to find new areas to create joint strategic needs assessments, we mustn't forget that the big killers are always the big killers, still remain the big killers: the obesity, the smoking, the drug abuse, the cardiovascular problems and the mental health problems. And they will always remain there, and therefore to return to those possibly in a slightly different manner. The idea that I'm getting here today is that we want health inequalities. So previously, when we looked at obesity and looked at mental health, we had a universal approach to dealing with the population as a whole. What I'm hearing here today is that people want a selective approach to look at those people who are greatest affected, because we know intervention in those people who are greatest effective gives the best return for the investment in terms of time and outcome. So that's my pitch: restoration, and also not to lose sight of the big killers and influencers of health, which have not gone away. They have only been magnified over the last 18 months. Thanks.
Thanks, John. And again, I think you're putting that health inequalities lens onto all of that, if I interpret correctly. So I've got Tim and then Michael, and John Towler's snuck in as well. So we'll have the three of you, of course, and then I'll need to help wrap this one up and go to the recommendations, but also to note, we won't go through them, but quite a lot of useful things going into the chat. So I'm sure we'll capture those as well. So Tim.
Thanks, Kathy. So a couple of points just to build on what's been said. I think the first, coming back to the principles, this is really important because this gives us population understanding, and we've said that we're going to be driven from a population perspective. And I think if we're honest, there's been a huge amount of time and effort, particularly from the DPH teams, put into this, but the value we've got out is probably underutilized because we haven't leveraged that. And actually in our organizations or at place, we'll have gone off and sourced our own information to inform what we want to do. So I think this is actually a test of, are we going to start from a population perspective? And so I think it's a good link back to what we discussed earlier. In terms of the question of how we resource it, how we get this done, I think there might be quite a lot of learning we can take from the development of the clinical service strategies that were done. So Nicole, who's on, obviously led those, will be able to add more than I. But there was a small coordinatory team who then drew on the experts and the interested to come together and at pace design things. And I think that kind of approach across all our organisations could bring together people to own these, and I think what we found from that is there are a significant amount of people who would want to come together and contribute. So I think that's a model we could look at if we're looking who would we want to actually draw on to try and take some of these forward under the support and auspices of the DPH teams. And similarly, I think there's a challenge to us all, both at organisation and place level. When we look at planning teams and strategy teams, we shouldn't be starting from a point of trying to create our own information. We should be starting from what we've got from the centralised point that's in the chat, because that will free up resources, and we can all contribute things and then try and do it in that standardised way, and all be coming back to, I think, what Nicole put in terms of the single version of the truth rather than looking at data differently. And then very briefly, finally, I think there is also one spin-off benefit this might lead further into, which is the discussion that's happened in City about the alignment between the Health and Wellbeing Board and Place, and how the governance and discussions sit, and has been mentioned from a county wellbeing board as well. I think if we've got this really strong singular approach that underpins it, actually this will lock together our focus on place, our understanding of the best areas to focus for the population, and how that links back to Health and Wellbeing boards in a stronger way as well, which would be a good step.
Thanks, Tim. Again, some good thoughts. I'm going to move straight on to Michael and then John, if you would be fairly brief, if you wouldn't mind.
Yep. Good afternoon, everyone. Michael Williams, Chair of Nottingham City Care. Firstly, I just wanted to reinforce the point you made at the beginning, Kathy, about the ICS partnership having this sort of strategic responsibility, holding the ring for the JSNA. I think that's important. So I was a little puzzled why the question was, how should the NHS body be doing that? You know, I'd be interested to know the thinking behind that. But the main point I wanted to make about two pleas for perhaps areas to look at. The first is that all of our objectives talk about healthy long life expectancy. And yet from all the Marmot studies and even the one more recently within the last few days has shown the stark difference between some geographical areas and areas of multiple deprivation, highlighting that health inequalities issue. So I think at a sort of superior level, we should be trying to understand why there is such a stark difference, 10, 11 years between some areas and others, and reprioritizing our resources to rebalance that, rather than continually sort of having it as a very general objective for everyone. We should be rebalancing priorities. The other one at a practical level is a plea for perhaps looking at diabetes as a practical area. Someone reckoned it consumes 25% of NHS expenditure. I don't know whether that's the case, but there are many practical things that can be done by way of diet, exercise, and treatment that can deal with that and prevent future disease. So it's very much there on the cusp of prevention and early intervention. So just those points, thank you.
Thanks very much, Michael. I'm going to turn to John. I just wonder, should we take the slides down now? I think we can probably manage without those just this minute. But John Towler, you've got the last input, and then I'll return to Jonathan very briefly, if you don't mind, Jonathan, and then I'll sum up.
Thanks, Kathy, and apologies for raising my hand somewhat late. So I guess an observation and a suggestion at the end, so I'll keep it brief. I think understanding health and well-being need is fundamental, and that's kind of stating the obvious, but it isn't of any use unless it drives our work. And the JSNA, I think over the years, has sometimes felt as if it's been a remote exercise. I agree that we need to link it to population health management, but speaking for myself and perhaps others, the detail of what population health management is doing and how it's contributing is not something that it feels is very visible to me and perhaps others. I think there are a number of other questions which we definitely aren't going to answer today, such as how does this inform each part of the new system? How do we make sure that our priorities are clinically led? How do we get really strong patient input into this work? And a few months ago, Amanda presented a single side of A4, which was a flow chart on how we get from understanding our population need through to putting in place the best possible integrated services that we can, which kind of picks up all those pieces that I've just said. So I wondered whether, as a result of the discussion we've had today, we might program into a future session as early as we can, revisiting that flow chart and trying just to tie it all together in a practical way as to how we think it will really work. I wonder whether that would be helpful.
Thanks, John. And we'll perhaps pick that bit up at the very end about how might the next steps and how things might work. Because I have to say that I'm really pleased with being able to have the conversation, but I regard it as the starting of a conversation. What we need to do today is agree some principles to work on. And then I think there's a lot of work to do in the background on this. But Jonathan, do you want to just final reflections from you, and then I'll try and address what we're asked to do in the board paper.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you, colleagues, for those suggestions, ideas, and which are very helpful. Because it's just the start of the conversation, I'm not going to try and address all of the comments made. Rather, selectively, I'm going to use, if I may, Michael's comments as a springboard to make one or two observations. Michael, I think you're bang on the money about the healthy life expectancy. What you didn't say, but I suspect you know from the way that you framed it, is that actually what we can put in place nationally and locally to address healthy life expectancy and some of the stark inequalities in healthy life expectancy is not altogether a mystery. But you're absolutely right. It does come down to, in many instances, rebalancing priorities. So I'm very keen to make sure that joint strategic needs assessment focuses us sufficiently on those really big issues. Perhaps they will be emerging issues and issues that will need to be tackled over the long run, not just over a few months. If I might be cheeky and go on just to comment on diabetes, we can discuss that one further, but actually I'm probably more interested in the risk factors for diabetes and the causes and the things that shape those risk factors and distribution in the population, rather than the disease itself, about which there is plenty published already. So we might do a job perhaps of pulling together some of that into one place more usefully. But actually, in terms of assessing the need and looking at the bits of it that are that are of joint interest to us, I think I probably want to take a step back and look at the causes of the causes. But we might debate that some more, and that's where we'll really value your engagement, I'm sure, both at City Health and Wellbeing Board and from you and your colleagues at County Health and Wellbeing Board as well. Back to you, Kathy.
Thank you very much. Now, thinking about the challenge that often Richard gives us is, have we heard everybody really? Have we heard anybody who disagrees? So everybody's been very positive and given some very good thoughts. Anybody want to give a contrary view or any thoughts of negativity towards this or anything that's very, very different from anything we've heard? Good. I'm going to take that as a general agreement then and support for the direction. So thank you for that. I think it's been great chance to have a look at the importance of, as you say, and as John has said, John Doddy said, JSNA has been around a long time. One of the key things for me though is really John Tower's point. In a way, I think this is John's point. I'm very keen on, early on I talked about the golden thread, and I think there has to be connectivity between what we plan to do, what we do, and what the outcomes are. And that needs to thread through from our PCNs, through our wards or PCNs, through our places, and through our overall health and wellbeing patches, if you like, our counties and cities and so on, into making a difference. And I think that's the bit that's going to matter in the end. What's our ambition around that, and what do we set out as our milestones ultimately? The ICS partnership can monitor against, and indeed the NHS board bit can monitor its bit. So with that in mind, I hope people agree with that. Can I just take us formally through the three recommendations? The first being the board is asked to acknowledge the joint and statutory responsibilities of the JSNA that falls to ICS partners. I'm assuming that's okay for everybody. Consider the implications of the joint CCG, ICS, NHS body. Well, it will be the ICS overall ultimately, and local authority input and resource requirements as per the required statutory duty. I mean, I don't think today we can solve the resource requirements, but I think we can acknowledge those, can't we, that there is some. Is that okay? And then finally agree that everybody will have a greater input into this for the future, because by doing that, we bring it alive and we have a chance of fulfilling the changes in outcomes. Is everybody content that we keep coming back to this? And I'm keen also to hear more from the Health and Wellbeing Boards at a future session on what the role of those are, and again, how we can all play our part, or those who are part of them can play their part in the wider system. Is that okay then? Everybody broadly happy with that? We can accept that paper. Thanks, Jonathan and Lucy. Great stuff. And I'm going to take us on now to, and just final thing on that, all those comments have been captured and will be played back in, I think, Joanna, is that right? Amanda, you're the next item. You're going to just do a bit of update on our key areas of work at the moment.
Yeah, thank you, Kathy. So, yeah, in May, we agreed to embed the outcomes framework and joint commissioning approaches and co-production in 3 areas that we called signature areas, because they're signalling a different way of working across the system. And we're now testing those as we go forward. So those areas are community care transformation, children and young people, and the integration of personalised or person-centred commissioning. And there's a key emphasis there on joining up the transformation of health and care to improve. So it's very much that joint health and care agenda in these areas. And I think all 3 are critical to the key aims of the ICS in terms of coordinated care, prevention and early intervention, and reducing waste and duplication. So work is underway now to develop a joint policy framework for that to happen in terms of how we come together, how we pool resources around that, and how we work together. And then the 3 areas are progressing with the design and delivery of the programme. So for community services, there's been a huge engagement exercise so far. Around over 150 system stakeholders have contributed to that. And then there will be a joint kind of co-design process over the summer to get the detailed design sort of blueprint, and then we can implement that. And we envisage that it will be implemented at place level and tailored for local populations. Children and young people, we've reviewed the joint commissioning arrangements in this area and intend to develop that further over the summer. We've also put in an expression of interest to NHSEI to become part of the Children and Young People Transformation Programme, which would fast track quite a bit of this work if we were successful in doing that. And that's specifically around children and young people with complex mental health and care and placement needs. So we're sort of fingers crossed for that. And then the personalised, person-centred commissioning. So there's a co-production strategy that is going to be tested, and the aim of that is very much to give people greater control and choice over their care. So these are often people with very complex health and care needs and complex packages around that. I'm pleased that the LGA is supporting the development of that joint commissioning framework to help move some of that forward. And again, this is probably an example of where it's truly a joint NHS and local government agenda. It really is critical that we fully work together on this to get the changes that we need. So really, this is really to note the progress. In relation to how we track the impact of this on the outcomes framework, there are some outcomes in our framework that appear in all 3 schemes, and we're proposing that we focus on those 5 areas. So it's those outcomes are the proportion of care that takes place in appropriate care settings, proportion of people recording their needs are met or reporting their needs are met, the proportion of people reporting having choice, control and dignity, increasing quality of life for people with care and support needs, and sustainable teams, integrated teams with skill mix designed around our population. So there are metrics around there, and we're proposing we focus on those areas to develop and report the metrics and some proxy measures, and then we collect data on those. So we do a kind of baseline on those and then report those at regular intervals into the board. And we're also asking views as part of the community engagement work around the metrics and outcomes, which will continue to develop over the summer. So we're proposing that we then baseline and put trajectories around those to come to the board. So that's an update of the work. There's a huge amount of enthusiasm and momentum around these 3 areas, which is great. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. I mean, I thought that was a really helpful update. I mean, it is largely here for update. I mean, I will take any specific or urgent questions on it, but I think that the idea really would be, and it's great to hear about the outcomes and what we can track, is that after the summer, when all that engagement and those workshops have gone on, I'm hoping, and Amanda and I've discussed this, that actually we'll get people who are leading these work streams to actually come and present to the board kind of what difference is this starting to make, you know, and what support do they need in order to do it, because at the end of the day we should be an enabling body that supports people to get on with the business, but connecting it back into the golden thread of what difference are we making sounds very positive. Is everybody content to note the good progress and look forward to seeing the populated outcomes and then the milestones, and broadly content with those particular outcomes that Amanda highlighted? Do I see a few nods? Tim's nodding, this is helpful. That's brilliant. Thank you, Amanda. You've done what I needed, which has helped me catch up a little bit, which thank you. I knew I could rely on you there. And the next item is the integrated performance report. And, you know, I first of all wanted to say that I thought this was really, I really like the way this is set out. I might be the only person on the planet who likes that, but I found that really helpful and really going in the right direction in terms of starting to help us. But, you know, I'm sure these things are always in evolution, and I'm sure people will have comments to improve it. So that's just on how it is. But I think, Amanda, I'm coming back to you, aren't I, just to take us points, and you've got 1 or 2 things to share. I think.
Yeah, thank you, Kathy. So I did want to highlight some key areas to the board linked to their 4 key aims of ICSs. So in Q1 this year, we've been balancing a number of challenges in the system, and we've got some really important delivery areas. So we have got increasing demand for and presentations for urgent care now coming through after the previous wave of the pandemic. And we've also been very focused on the recovery of planned procedures and operations, and the MSK presentation demonstrated why that was critical. And also the vaccine rollout at pace, which has been a huge system undertaking. And really proud that we are one of the national planned care accelerator sites. So we have been able to attract additional resource, and we have been able to do additional procedures, and we're continuing to do that. So that's very good for our population. And it has enabled people to access treatments more quickly than they would have otherwise done. We are seeing more mental health presentations, both in terms of volume and acuity. So colleagues have been, managing some really quite significant pressures in those services as well. I also wanted to highlight another very significant challenge in our system, which is around the maternity services at NUH, and this is very clearly very concerning for our population and not, well, the position that we would want for our population. And so, again, I think we are all working very closely as a system to address those issues as quickly as we possibly can. As also just wanted to highlight that we have been continuing to develop the ICS, as we talked about earlier on. The vaccination programme, we've delivered over 1.1 million vaccines, which is a very, very significant endeavour, and working really hard to meet the commitment that all adults are offered their first dose and 2/3 of adults offered their second dose by the 19th of July. And there's obviously some critical sort of decisions around the roadmap around that. And also I just wanted to highlight that thanks to actually very good partnership working, we have made some really important inroads into inequalities, and the local community engagement, community leaders, supporting that endeavour, supporting uptake, outreach, going into faith communities, etc., has made very significant differences, and I think that's a real live example of integrated working having an impact on inequalities. In terms of system transformation and efficiency, we do have distributed leadership of schemes across the system. Some are co-led across NHS and local authority partners where that is beneficial in terms of the interfaces of services, which is really, again, I think something to build on. We've got senior SRO sponsorship and matrix working with the teams sitting underneath those SROs. So that's helping us to develop the 3-year financial strategy and transformation schemes as well. And we need to be ready to implement those from H2 onwards and then into next financial year. And that's clearly an area where we are closely monitored by NHS England in improvement because of our underlying deficit, particularly in the NHS. In terms of people and culture, we're very focused and mindful that we do need to support staff recovery. Sickness and absence is a concern, and obviously at the moment with the pressures, there's a lot of people having to self-isolate to try and reduce the spread of COVID. So that is having an impact in areas. And we are also very focused on additional primary care roles and supporting the development of capabilities in PCNs and integrated care teams. This time you'll see in the report we have got a focus on health inequalities, and I think unfortunately it does starkly show that presentations for A&E and emergency admissions are highest in the most deprived areas. This is something
Amanda,
we have seen. Yeah.
Amanda, can I just ask you something? Could you just explain clearly to us all how to interpret the graphs?
Yeah.
Would you mind?
Yeah, of course.
Maybe for just me, but it would be really helpful.
Yeah, I'll just find them on my.
Thank you.
So yeah, so on the graphs there are. So we've got. I think it's a really good way of cutting it. Actually, we've got presentations by deprivation quintile, so how the sort of most to least deprived quintiles, also ethnic group as well, and also in our places. And what it shows is the presentations compared to what you would expect for the sort of population size. Now, in terms of deprivation, we have known, and we have observed this both particularly in the city and mid-Nots, that people from more deprived communities are more likely to need to go to A&E or use A&E as a port by which to access healthcare. And I think that shows very, very, very clearly on these graphs. So that's the first, if you like, column that shows that. And you can see that that pattern isn't quite the same for planned care. In fact, you can see that so in the most there is still, you know, more presentations, but probably a bit less than you'd expect, and that does suggest that people are presenting later in their illness journey from more deprived communities, which is something clearly we would want to address as a system. Okay. Again, similarly, you can see different patterns of presentation by ethnic group as well. And again, some underrepresentation in healthcare, you know, in seeking healthcare or presenting at accessing healthcare in there. And you can see also linked to that in the city, you can see there's probably more than expected emergency presentations and fewer than expected planned presentations, if I recall correctly. Yeah, that's right. So I don't know if that's helpful, and probably Jonathan and Lucy might want to add to that, but I think it quite starkly shows differential access to healthcare services by those sort of key areas. And interesting that different geographies as well show slightly different patterns.
Thank you, Amanda. I mean, just before I bring colleagues in who I think want to come in and make some comments on this, I think it's really helpful to start to get some data coming through actually about health inequalities that shows what impact might it be having, and I'm sure we can develop and build on that. My other comment though would be that whilst I really like the way this is all laid out and so on, it still strikes me as quite NHS focused, or is that an illusion that only I can see? And I don't know if it has to be like that, not the health inequalities bit, but the rest of it. You know, the workforce, for example, is all about the NHS, I think. And in the future, you know, this concept of a one workforce, maybe NHS, but I get the sense of one workforce for our population. So I think some things perhaps still to work on there, but let me turn to people who want to come in. I'm going to go the different way up from usual. I'm going to start with John Bruin and then go to Mike Crowe.
That's very kind of you, Kathy. Thank you. I just wanted to emphasise Amanda's points that she made about the vaccination programme, and because I think there's two really important learning points for us as a system. Amanda described them, but just to sort of elaborate, really, I think it's been a really powerful example of system work, and we've had brilliant collaboration across all the NHS organisations, primary care, local authorities, both city and council, have been phenomenal in their efforts to rally and encourage and cajole our citizens to get jabbed, and it's been phenomenally informed by public health departments and data. So it's a great example of system working, but also from that data, the programme that we've rolled out has been informed at the front by health inequalities data. So the Victor, the bus, goes to those areas where there's, you know, those least, the most deprived quintiles that we've just been hearing about, and does the jabbing. And we've got some emergent data that shows how we've enabled those communities, those vulnerable communities, to catch up. I think there's lots of learning for us as a system, how we can translate that into other things we do, because I think those of us that have been at the sharp end of that just sort of launched ourselves into it, and some of the risk aversion and the governance that we try and build into our program design wasn't there. So it was a bit bruising to start with, because we got rightly criticised a bit by regional teams and such, but it enabled us to get to a pretty good place. And I think sometimes when we are designing programs, we get a bit protective and risk averse, and we end up not quite doing what we need to do. So I think this would be a really good sort of endeavour to pick some of the threads out of that programme that we've done on the vaccinations. Thank you.
Thanks, John. And in another place, we've been doing reports on progress, you know, the various phases of the COVID, and also some technical learning. What have we learned through it? I just wonder if anybody's planning to actually write something up on this and actually go through a process of capturing people's inputs and doing that. I don't know, Amanda, can I ask you, do we think anybody's going to be doing that? Because if not, I would just like to suggest maybe that we should.
Yeah, I mean, there is some stuff there that the teams have pulled together, so we could definitely build on that. Yeah, and have something. Yeah.
I think it'd be good to have an actual formal paper that everybody gets to see, to say what has the learning been, because we so often say we must learn from things, and then do we? Sometimes, perhaps not always, but this is such an opportunity, isn't it, around that. Anyway, I'm distracting us, so thank you, John. Good points.
Sorry, Kathy, can I just come in there? I'm Lucy Harbour, I'm the new Director of Public Health for the City. I've just come off a conversation with colleagues around actually doing that sort of stock take on the vaccination programme, about what was our strategic aim around inequalities, what have we done and why did we do those things, what were the operational parameters that changed what we did, either for the better or for the challenge, and then looking forward to the next puzzle. So that might be the foundation of some of that work, taking it forward, if that would be helpful.
Sounds good. But I think actually creating it into something that, building on that, I think, Lucy, would be great, actually. Thank you. So I'm going, what am I doing really? Because I'm going up my list. Adele, again, is that, your hand doesn't seem to be able to go down, so it might still be legacy, but do you want to come in?
I think, well, I'm not sure what that says. I think Lucy's kind of covered the point I wanted to make, really, is that I think we still have, you know, building on what we have learned, we can, you know, we can certainly all commit ourselves again to operating everything that we do, including the vaccination programme, through that lens, as you put it, of health inequalities, as we have, you know, we have some significantly disadvantaged communities in the city that we really need to make sure we reach. And so I'm sure we want to all commit to do everything we can and marshal our resource to that end. We had a really interesting door knock during the big weekend, which was it's so enlightening, actually. And you know, obviously you know that comms don't reach everybody, so I think it'd be worthwhile us or public health colleagues sharing some of the conversations we had on the doorstep that were really, you know, useful for the conversations, but also it was really impactful going and having those conversations with people. Really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Adele. Mike Crowe.
I just from obviously I'm a clinical director of Bestwood and Sherwood PCN, which is obviously a city primary care network, and you know, the graph of health inequalities is really familiar and not surprising. So, and I think it's just important that we obviously dig into those graphs a bit more and find out ultimately what's underneath those. So we sort of make assumptions, I guess, in terms of what's causing that, and I'm sure the assumptions are right, but it's probably multiple factors. Certainly, access to general practice is likely to be a factor. That is to say, being able to get an appointment, or indeed when you get an appointment, the length of the appointment and all of these things, and then the reasons why that might be in individual practices. So all that needs to be sort of dug into, and certainly there's potentially an issue around funding formulas and things that we need to look at, which will help strengthen general practice. But there's also probably other features around things like elective admissions and planned care outpatients. So that's things like referrals to see someone in outpatients and then go on to have a procedure planned. And that speaks a bit to the previous thing about people not getting joint replacements. And there may be something in the bureaucracy of getting outpatients that's also a barrier. So there's lots of things that could be barriers, I guess. And it's just really important to drill into that, I think. And the other point I wanted to mention was the additional roles in primary care networks on line 30 that Amanda mentioned, and Amanda's right, there is really good progress being made on that. And for people who don't know, that's about expanding the mix of professionals that work in general practice and hopefully getting out of the idea of you know, a general practice being all about kind of doctors and seeing doctors, and be much broader in terms of the scope of professionals who work there. And there is good progress there. Physician associates, pharmacists, social prescribers all being recruited. But we are starting to come up against a barrier of estates and space and where to put people. And there's an awful lot of work needs to be done on that. And that might, so whilst resources coming to recruiting, that there is a little bit of a danger on the horizon that we might not have anywhere to put people. And that's really important to flag up. So
Thanks,
there is good progress, but worth mentioning.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. We're seeing good to see some data on this, but as you say, I think there's an awful lot behind it. It just gives you a sort of taster, really, isn't it, of what there might be there. I think, Amanda, is that fair to say? Good. Conscious of time, and we do have to move on to a meeting after this as well. And I know people have previously said it's hard to maintain your energy late on an afternoon, and I need to be mindful of that. But let's move on to Richard and then Till and Michael. If you could all be reasonably succinct, that might just help. Thank you.
Thanks. On the page that's entitled System Delivery Dashboard, halfway down on the left-hand side, we have the 9 service areas under constitutional and H1 metrics delivery. Is my reading of that correct, that we're off track on all 9 of them?
We appear to be, yes. Amanda, anything on?
Yes, it's against the national standards, Richard. So yes.
So my view is, I think sometimes optimism bias can kick into these conversations, and inevitably there's lots of good work taking place, but we can sort of say how well we're doing objectively against those 9 areas. I recognise it probably is quite through the NHS health lens, but we are off track. So not today, but we need to ensure that the governance is in place to ensure that we're gaining some control over those important areas.
I agree. Many of those that we won't have set locally, they'll be against the national ones, Richard. But yeah.
But I think it's a really good point, and I think that I was going to make the point, perhaps I can do it now. The distributed leadership. I think there are hopefully people who are largely leading on each of those areas, and I think perhaps the messages, if the SROs, the people who are leading across the system on some of these, could just take that away, and they will already know. If you're leading on urgent care or planned care, you know where we are. But if we can ask people to just take that away and reflect and bring back, any thoughts for next time. But thank you, good point. Tilan.
Yes, thank you, Kathy. It's very quickly, the first part about is, in terms of the health inequalities view of system performance, I'm also struggling to acknowledge the fact that that is actually a reflection of the health inequalities in the system. The reason I'm saying that is a couple of learnings which we learned from the MSK dashboard is what we are seeing here is the mode of access to NHS services can probably be partly explained by the health inequalities, but it wouldn't be a true reflection of deprivation itself. For example, it could be a reflection of how the services of pathways have been set up. So the two things which we learned from an MSK was that between GP practices, outpatient rates for MSK services would vary by over 2-fold and inpatient rates by over 3-fold after correlation for age and sex. But there appeared to be no pattern related to levels of deprivation among the registered patients within a practice. And equally, need and demand was not most importantly driven by the demographic changes like age, which kind of contributes to about 10% of the UK healthcare, but it increases by the intensity and volume of clinical practice, which kind of accounts to about 60% of the increased demand. So it shows the clinical variation can be a driver for the demand and what we are seeing. So I struggle to acknowledge that page as a health inequalities view of the system without knowing the details sitting beneath it. So I just thought it was a bit of a pushback onto that. My second point, Kathy, was on the system delivery dashboard. I'll be very brief on that. If we go right down on the left-hand side, on the 4 worst performing areas. So we've identified 4 in this indicators where as a system we are outliers. And very quickly, like we discussed when Richard mentioned about the partnership agreement, how does that percolate to individual organizations? Similarly, how does this sort of indicators percolates among the individual partners within the ICS? The reason being is, as you might be aware, in Mansfield and Ashfield, we've got a targeted lung health check program, which is sole aim is to improve the early diagnosis of lung cancer, which will obviously have system benefits. But we did run up to some trouble in terms of some delays in the program because of discussions around funding. I won't go into detail, but it's been resolved. The reason I said that is there seemed to be a lack of awareness, those sort of challenges in a system, and sometimes working within organizational silos trumped over looking at the system view of the challenges which we had a system. So I'm more than happy outside this meeting to go into detail if anyone wants to go in, but and I'm the clinical director of that program, just as a conflict of interest.
Thank you. I mean, my sense is that this information is doing what good information should, which is get people to ask questions. And that's an important part of all of that. I am hoping that this is kind of a tip of an iceberg in which people are actually working, so that, for example, we're not in a great shape on maternal smoking. I hope that is known within the areas which can influence that. But the other point I would make is that some of the health inequality things, it's easy to focus on what was the solution from a health point of view. And actually, what we really want to do is get way upstream so that people don't need the help in the same way. But obviously that takes time, doesn't it? Okay, so I thank you for the discussion on that. I think we've identified there's a lot more work to do, can we ask that those of you who can influence areas where we're not doing terribly well, just take personal responsibility for taking those away and do some work on those. We would like to move on. I think Richard's point is really valid. You can be doing loads of work, running like mad, but actually completely missing the point, actually moving the dial. And that's at the end of the day, that's what we have got to do on behalf of our population. But an advance from my perspective in terms of how we're seeing that. So thank you. Now, we've got a number of things in very short time as it happens, but largely I think these are things for mainly noting. But can I first of all turn to John Towler? I presume you're going to obviously we've read the note from the Transition and Risk Committee, but can you just sort of bring that alive for us?
Sure. Thanks, Kathy. I'll keep it brief. So hopefully the format of the report is helpful to colleagues. So firstly, most importantly, there are no transition actions rated as red. There were some ambers, but the vast majority of those are waiting for the publication of the design framework. And now that is out, those can all be progressed, I suppose, notwithstanding your earlier comments, Kathy, that we may get paused by the appointment of the new Secretary of State for Health and Social Care. But good news that in principle, those can all be progressed now. The committee discussed the assurance arrangements around the transition work of people and culture, date and finance. Those three areas are not formal transition work streams. They have separate committee arrangements. And committee members discussed how we can ensure that those issues remain connected to the other elements contained within the design framework. And there was a pretty strong feeling from a number of colleagues that in the short term, which I would define as 3 months, just while the wider ICS assurance arrangements are being fleshed out, that the Transition and Risk Committee might take on delegated assurance from the ICS board for the transition elements, so not the whole of finance, the transition elements of the people and culture, date and finance work. Di Gamble sits on the committee on behalf of NHSEI, and she very strongly promoted the view that NHSEI would find that helpful from a visibility perspective. So we seek approval from the board for that recommendation. I'll leave it there, Kathy.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John, and thank you for the work that's going on in this group. I know it's a huge task, and I'm sure in future meetings we'll get a bit more. We'll want to hear a bit more as things start to move. But can I specifically ask colleagues, are we content that, say, over the next 3 months, as John highlights, that whilst we get the other governance arrangements in place, and we are having those discussions, that this committee keeps an eye on things for us in an assurance way? People content with that? Is there anybody not content? It's perhaps the easiest thing to ask. I don't hear anything particular. Thank you. I'm very conscious in these meetings, Richard Henderson, that you're here, and a lot of this we don't sort of directly talk about things that you can engage with. So just conscious of that. Good. So can we move on then to the next item? I think this is Rosa. Are you going to just bring this one alive as well?
Thanks, Kathy. Yes, so noting the comments on the paper, and as Amanda's already alluded to, a focus in the Quality Committee around the areas of enhanced surveillance in our area. But I just wanted really to draw the board's attention more to the slide around our agreed quality principles for how we're going to move forward working together. And you'll see on that slide they've been aligned against our ICS partnership compact and really reflect the way that we're going to take quality as a shared priority together in the future. So you'll also see a set of next steps, recognising that there is work to do to transition our current quality arrangements into a greater system space. And those next steps reflect both our own ambitions and the plans around the development of the ICS. So I would just ask the board to note and endorse those quality principles and note the current areas of enhanced surveillance.
Thank you. Rosa. Are there any comments on that? I think one of the things we will need to make sure is that as we move into having an assurance arrangement around quality, there's a question for me about whether or not we have quality and inequality in an assurance committee, not for deciding now, but I think it is a question to have. I'd rather not have too many subcommittees, and I just wonder if quality and inequality go together. And also, I think we need to ensure that we've got on there lots about citizens and ambition, but I think we need to make sure that it's not just NHS, that it's quality linked up right across, because you can do things in one bit of the system that impact negatively on the quality in a different part. So I think we need that joined up. Rosa.
And thanks, Cathy. And actually, the committee is well attended by system partners, and some of the areas of focus of the meeting before last around closed cultures very much echoed as a learning across our system in a number of sort of care settings, regardless of them being NHS or social care or any setting really. So we're starting to do some work around how we make that meaningful. And I think there is something, Cathy, as you've talked about, to look at quality in its broadest sense and not get, which might include inequalities and other things, and not get caught up in a sort of quality assurance loop, which is something very different from the role of the ICS.
Absolutely. So thank you. Everybody happy to note and accept that report? And it takes us on, Stuart, to yours, finance. Again, we have to put for information, but if you just want to just say something very brief, that would be great.
I will indeed. Thank you. The report really just covers the work that's been ongoing across the system over really the last year or so, in terms of improving the way in which we work together in the system in preparation for a more formalised arrangement in the future. And really there's four national areas that we've been working on. One's to understand our current finances and where we are at the moment. One's to establish a 3-year financial plan moving forward. The third area would be how we're going to transform our services to live within our means. And then the fourth one is about how we put together a financial framework of governance moving forward so that we can take collective decisions about resources and the allocation of resources moving forward. So the report covers progress in those four areas really, and is brought to the ICS today for information.
Thank you very much. Hope everybody found that informative. And we'll move on then to the next thing. We do need to, Miranda, if you can pick up the transition governance in terms of reference for us as well, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Cathy. So the paper sets out the transition governance arrangements, and this is designed to enable us to prepare for statutory status, and it will evolve into shadow arrangements from December, assuming that the national timescales remain as they currently are. And then we've also given consideration to our key strategic risks, and we're asking for approval of those so that we can start to incorporate those into an ICS board assurance framework. In terms of the governance arrangements, the transition arrangements have been developed with input from across the system, with reference to the design framework as well, and areas we'll need to develop into statutory status, so we've focused on those areas. We've also looked at national best practice. The system executive group has also done a review of system-wide work streams, and we have also stolen with pride from elsewhere. So, for example, the Transition and Risk Committee terms of reference are based on the Derbyshire arrangement, so we've sort of pinched and borrowed from elsewhere. The transition governance does include the establishment of some assurance committees, as you've mentioned, Cathy, and some proposals there. And I think we also very much recognise the importance of the clinical and care professional leadership and how that's developing. So you can see within the pack of papers the arrangements around the clinical executive and how we would like that to establish. So for today, we're asking for agreement of the transition governance arrangements as they're set out. And as I say, they've been sort of iterated across the system. Note that these will continue to evolve, so they are a sort of a temporary state as we move towards shadow operation. And we're also asking for approval of the terms of reference for the ICS Transition and Risk Committee and the Clinical Executive Group. And we're asking for approval of the strategic risks so that we can progress the work on the system assurance framework. Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. So we've actually got some decisions to make here. And I think, Joanna, we are core 8, aren't we, in terms of any decisions that we make now? We may not have been at the beginning, but we are now, which is great. So anything from anybody on each of these? The governance arrangements and the diagrams, perhaps the most helpful thing in a way to get a summary view, isn't it, of those? And I think helpfully the colours are set out there. So blue is the assurance bits, and you know, the other colours are the delivery in green and advisory in orange. Are people content with that? It is kind of as it is at the moment. John Bruin.
Yeah, thanks. Noting Amanda's statement, this is iterative and developmental. And given the huge task we've got around workforce across all our different organisations, my question would be that whether we need to consider raising the profile of the people and culture so that we've got a much higher level of oversight and sort of governance assurance about all the things that we need to do, not only to recruit, but to retain people across all our system. And I'm just a bit concerned that at the minute it's a bit buried.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, John. I mean, I think in some systems there are indeed a sort of appropriate people and culture group at the same level as a quality committee and so on and so forth. Is that the kind of area you're talking about?
Sorry, yes.
Yeah. Does anybody disagree with that? Because people is so important, isn't it? And we need somewhere to for a people board, people committee to, you know, people group, whatever, to report to workforce and all the rest of it as well. So can we take that away, Amanda, and do some work to develop that?
Yes, we'll add that, yeah.
That would be brilliant. But other than that, are people broadly content? It is only transition, but it's important that we have something that's both simple but effective during transition. And then the next question was that obviously these all need further development. I think that's self-evident, isn't it? So that's good. In terms of reference for the ICS Transition and Risk Committee and the ICS Clinical Executive Group, are we broadly content? Because if there are any details, they can be passed through. It's very difficult to design these things word by word, isn't it, in committee? So are we broadly content with those two? I'm not hearing anybody disagreeing. Again, if anybody disagree, I need to get better at the checking on the disagreeing. Good, well done then. That's a good job, isn't it? And then the strategic risks to enable the full development of an ICS board assurance framework, because I think that's something we have to have. Are we content with the proposals so far? Looks like we are, so that's good. Thank you very much for all of that. We've gone over those quite quickly. There's a lot of work into it, so thank you to the people who've done that. So finally, I think we're on to questions from the public. As far as I'm aware, we haven't had any sent in, Joanna, is that correct? I'd love us to get to a place where we do have, you know, questions from the public, because I think that would, well, I think it's really important that we do that. So we need to think about, perhaps Alex, we can think about what else we can do around that. But thank you for that. And then review of the meeting against the partnership agreement. Just before we go to that, there was one question I was wanting to ask earlier and I never found a moment, is we talked about distributed leadership. Does everybody feel it is distributed? Do people feel that there are different people leading different things? Or does anybody feel that it's really not? Okay. Just thought I'd ask that. That's helpful. Have we functioned in line with the partnership agreement? We haven't had any major disagreements, I have to say, today. I think that largely we have happened to be along the same lines. We've had some good, rich discussions. Anybody want to make any comments on that? Okay, and you will also notice you've got a feedback questionnaire to complete and return. I'm very keen that everybody does that, because again, you know, if we're purporting to be part of learning organisations, we should learn too. And I'm really, really keen to get warts and all feedback so we can iterate and so on. And also on whether or not the content of this board meeting was, you know, was it in keeping with our ambitions around our 4 aims and our overall purpose. So that will be helpful to know. You get August off for, I'm not sure if it's good behaviour or just being in existence really, but anyway, we do sort of get August off from these meetings, which I always think is a good thing. And the next one will be in September. So I'll close the meeting in public